What's up, everybody? It's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And here's one for you. When I met my wife, she was a country music DJ. I'm not kidding. That's literally what her job was. She was 18, and in Ord, Nebraska, she worked at KNLV, North Loop Valley. I think that's what it is. KNLV. That sounds right. And she played country music as well as polka music, because Ord, Nebraska is in an area sometimes affectionately referred to as the Bohemian Alps. And then she would do the little channel identifiers during Kansas City Royals baseball games, because they carried that as an affiliate back then. But the funny thing is that she doesn't like country music, and she didn't then, and she doesn't now. You know, it's like the kid that lives in the small town out in the sticks, and so whatever the town likes, the kid doesn't like. Nah, go off somewhere, I don't know, listen to pop music and be a rock star and do something different. That wasn't a very good Camilla impersonation. I don't know if she ever said that stuff, but I think that's why she didn't like country, because it was too much like her upbringing. She was too cool for it. But deep down, I think she maybe actually kind of liked it. And still to this day, whenever I bring up 90s country stuff with her, she kind of, blushes that she knows a little bit about it. But I was thinking the other day that she had told me about an essay she wrote in high school that was entirely made of phrases from country music that had been popular that year. And so I'm sitting down to work on this thing that you and I are doing right now, Matthew chapter 24 and the Olivet Discourse, and looking at the parts of the Olivet Discourse, as promised yesterday, that draw us back into the Old Testament. There are tons of allusions here. And I was like, you know what? I wonder if I can find that essay, because I think that totally fits. It's like the likewise of all likewises. So I dug around in the attic, and I'm not kidding. Like, the first box I opened, there's this essay sitting right on top, and it's titled, it was typed like with a typewriter. It's titled, "If It Weren't for Country Music," and then ellipses, by Camilla Ritchie. And so I'm just delighted to get to share some of what 18-year-old my wife wrote about country music. What would we do without country music? I've pondered this question for many months and come to the same conclusion as the title of Clinton Gregory's song, "We'd Go Crazy." You must be asking, I don't even know who I have no idea who that is. You must be asking, as I used to, why in the world would I go crazy without country music? Well, the answer is simple. How many times in everyday life and conversation does something come up and the only possible response we have is in the title of some given country song? For example, who says you can't have it all? She's in love with the boy. Does he love you? She never cried when Old Yeller died. Do you think I'll cry when she's gone? Why would anyone ever say that in conversation? 18-year-old beauty Camilla, what are you talking about? And then she goes on and she composes this whole little essay that is all made of country music titles and lyrics. This song remembers when I couldn't see you leaving. There's no use crying over spilled perfume. I just need a jukebox with a country song. Like, there's so many of these little references in there that I have to dig way back into the memory banks for. And this is one of those where, we're going to get down to business, but I wanted to tell you this stuff about my family. So we're a ways into it. Thank you for indulging me on all of that. But you see what's going on here. She wrote this whole essay, and if you just read it to somebody who's familiar with the source material, there would be a whole bunch of those little phrases that would boom, pop. And people will be like, ha, 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 I see what you're doing there. Oh, yeah, I remember that song. It's Alan Jackson. Oh, sure. That's Colin Ray. I remember that one from when I was a kid, too. Oh, that's great. I see what you did. And every one of those little lyrics that are referenced in passing in this thing that she put together would, of course, conjure in the mind of a person where they were when they first heard that song, or when they went and bought the cassette single and put it in their car and drove down country roads and listened to that one, or the time that they danced with that handsome boy or that pretty girl at that school dance, or maybe a picture of the music video and the little story that was unfolding on the music video that they saw. It's all attached to something. And what, very intuitively, 18-year-old Camilla is doing here, she's grabbing onto all of these different themes with just a phrase, but that phrase is like just picking the tip of the iceberg and lifting up the whole giant iceberg out of the water, because there's so much attached to that. Here it is. Likewise, in Matthew chapter 24 in the Olivet Discourse, there is so much Old Testament that is being alluded to or directly referenced in this material that you and I just looked at over the last couple of weeks. The disciples asked Jesus a question. When is all this stuff going to wrap up? What's going to be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And then he gives them, so far, a 3.5-part answer. Part 1, you're going to see a bunch of things that are going to happen. They're going to seem like a big deal, but that's not it. That's not the end. Just keep soldiering on, do kingdom things. World kingdom's going to world kingdom, don't freak out. Then there is going to be some kind of profaning of something holy, of the temple. Stuff's going to get a little bit weird and difficult after that. It might be a challenging time. And during that challenging time, some people are going to come along and be like, there's Jesus, there's the Christ, there's the Son of Man. No, don't go after that stuff. You will know when it's the Son of Man, like the Carney Archway Monument. You will not be able to miss it. And then he says the actual sign will appear in front of everybody in the sky, and the Son of Man will return. And yep, that's difficult to conceive or wrap your brain around, but that's what he says is going to happen. Throughout that answer, he isn't just hitting his original audience cold with all of this stuff. He's drawing on all sorts of imagery and phrases that he's conjuring efficiently, so that this seemingly very bizarre prediction about the future is actually very rooted in the past. And it would be easy at this point to balk a little bit and be like, I don't know, this is another one of those places where when we look at the Bible, it feels like there's a little bit of a stretch, like maybe we're connecting dots that aren't really connected there. But even if you aren't a country music person, how many of you looked at that title and you were like, don't ask her on a straight tequila night? Because it's just in your head. And that song, you don't know why it earwormed in there or when exactly it happened, but it's there. And that little meaning nugget of that phrase and that tune has attached to it a much larger meaning packet trailing along behind it. And if we both know that that is a normal part of how communication works in our lives today, that's a normal part of how cultural texts work in our lives today, then it only makes sense to expect that people way back in the day who had human experiences and a culture just like you and I also were used to these little tiny nuggets of meaning, little phrases and so forth that were attached to much larger packets of meaning trailing behind. And oftentimes we see Jesus and the biblical authors weaponizing that. And again, I think we're seeing that say very, very much by saying only very, very little technique being employed here in Matthew 24, verses 29 through 31, with all of this business about the actual return of the king. And see what I just did right there? I just did the thing that we're talking about is Return of the. There's a book by J.R.R. Tolkien. I might be over communicating right now. Today, with what little bit of time we have left, because I took all of our time talking about that country music song, and I have no regrets. And with our time tomorrow, I want to look at those points of connection that I think pretty much everybody who does this for a living, all the scholars and the fancy people, everybody agrees as to what passages are being pointed out here. So this is a list that if you want to cheat ahead, you can probably just go Google it. But it might be more fun if we do the work together. So let's just get started on it. We'll see how far we get, and then we'll suspend it and pick it up tomorrow. Matthew 24:29. And I particularly want to zero in on this last stretch about after the distress of those days, here's what's going to happen. The sign is going to appear in the sky and all of that business, because there's a ton just right here. So right at the beginning of Matthew 29, you get immediately after the distress of those days. That looks like it corresponds to stuff back in Daniel. Now, Daniel, as you probably recall, has already factored very heavily in Matthew chapter 24 and this Olivet discourse. Yes, I am buying time while I turn the page, but I think this is also providing value. And Jesus even specifically calls out that prophet Daniel when discussing the abomination that causes desolation that Daniel mentions in chapter 9 of his book. But getting toward the end of the book of Daniel, I think it's just 12 chapters, right? Yeah. So the very last chapter in the book of Daniel, verse 1, we get a reference to this time of difficulty and suffering. It says, "At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress, such as has not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt." Whoa! So we got some kind of promise of resurrection here, which again just flies in the face of the positions of Jesus' enemies, the Sadducees, who argued that there was no life after death, no resurrection of the dead. Well, I don't know what Daniel they were reading, but if they're reading Daniel like we just read Daniel, it looks like the Bible, as you and I discussed in a much earlier episode, really directly points to this idea of resurrection. But it would seem that what Jesus is alluding to here in really everything that he mentions after the abomination that causes desolation, this dreadful time, nursing mothers and pregnant women suffering, and take your flight up to the mountains. It's going to be freaky and difficult. It seems like that time of distress that we just looked at in Daniel 12:1 would somehow correspond to that, and it looks like Jesus is making it correspond to that. Again, what's the exact timeline? We don't know, other than there is some kind of distress that occurs. Moving on to the rest of verse 29, it says, again, immediately after the distress of those days, quote, and it's set aside in quotes in the text if you're not reading along with me right now, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Now, when we looked at that, I pointed out that that's definitely a reference to Isaiah 13, but I think I mumbled something about like I think there's more. Well, I went and looked that up. That is a reference to more than just Isaiah 13:10. It's a reference to a clump of like 5 different chunks of Bible. And you know what? I think that provides us with a good breaking point. Tomorrow we are going to go and look at all of the different chunks of Bible and the immediate context that Jesus is drawing on in this description of the sun being darkened and the moon and all of these other natural calamities that are anticipated. And maybe we can get a little bit more of a sense by looking at that context of what the invocation of this batch of phrases would have conjured in the minds of the original audience, in the same way that Camilla's essay using only the titles of country music songs certainly would have conjured a whole bunch of other things using only those phrases to bring to mind all of those other connotations. So this is clearly intended to do the same thing, given how much Bible is being referenced and crammed into this dense little aside, this dense little quote that Jesus is using to describe this time of great difficulty. It seems like we got something there to unpack that's going to be interesting and maybe help us understand this difficult passage better than we understand it already. It's a pity Jeff's got nothing to work with as a musical homage on the way out the door today. Oh well. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.